You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Tuesday evening, joined by Jeff Shott, who's going to tell us about his conversion to Catholicism. He was featured actually not too long ago at the Coming Home Network, where he goes over his conversion story from mocking Jesus to worshiping him. I know the Coming Home Network puts out really, really good stuff, so I look forward to hearing this conversion story. But before we hear it, let me just welcome you to the show, Jeff. How are you?
Doing quite well. Thanks, Michael. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate your time. I've been following your stuff for a while. It actually played a pretty big role in my conversion process, so it's very helpful.
Wow. So how long ago did you actually convert?
This past Easter vigil was 5 years ago that I became Catholic.
Okay, so still fairly recent. Cool.
Yeah, pretty recently, yeah.
So let's start with the beginning. I mean, what were you, originally, what kind of household were you brought up in?
I was raised a Baptist. My brothers and I were all homeschooled originally in Florida. We were originally in like the Largo, Clearwater area. Mm-hmm. And since we were homeschooled, we were part of a co-op group with other homeschooled students at my church. So not only were we going to church on Sundays, but we were there probably 2, 3, maybe 4 times throughout the week doing different things with the other kids so that we wouldn't be, isolated. Yeah. We still had a lot of socialization. So my whole, early childhood was very church centered.
Yeah. So Baptist, was this Southern Baptist or different?
Honestly, I wasn't paying attention at the time. I was so young. But I would say it was pretty fundamentalist Baptist. That kind of played a role in why I ended up having struggles later on. We were taught like young earth creationism, stuff like that. Also,
there tends to be some anti-Catholic, sentiments among fundamentalist Baptists. So I've been around that before. I know how that goes. So So I mean, kind of walk us through the journey to Catholicism.
Yeah. So like I said, it started when I was being raised as Baptist, and I was pretty on fire for the faith as far back as I can remember. We had like the Awanas program, if you're familiar with that. It's kind of like...
Heard of it.
It's it's basically the Sunday school class that a lot of Baptists do, where they will teach the kids, how to memorize Bible verses and all the different stories, and then kind of get them the basics of Christianity. And when I was younger, actually, instead of trying to graduate from that, I ended up coming back when I was older to help teach the younger kids. So I was really involved in it, and all of my friends and family were from that church. Even if we weren't at church, we were hanging out with people who were there on Sundays and throughout the week. And so that was pretty much, all the way through what would be elementary school. And then when I was going into what would be like the 5th grade, that's when I entered the public school system for the first time. And so that was when I kind of encountered the fact that there are people who aren't Christians in the world, because everybody I had ever met pretty much up until that point was Christian. And so 5th grade didn't really make that much of a difference. But when I went to middle school, that's when my family moved to Tennessee. And, which is very Christian, very Protestant area, the Bible Belt. But when I was going to middle school, I actually lived in the neighborhood that was across the street from the school. So I would walk to and from school every day. And I got to know the other kids who lived in my neighborhood who would also walk to and from school every day. And surprisingly, almost all of them were not Christians, which wasn't really common in Tennessee. Usually almost everybody is, but it just so happened that the people I was walking to and from school every day with weren't Christians. They might have called themselves deists or agnostics, stuff like that. And so we got to talking about a lot of different things. And, I had been trained to evangelize and stuff like that. So when I started talking to them, I started trying to, share the gospel with them and stuff. And that was, their reactions were kind of where I started questioning things. Not so much the theological questions that they raised, but they really started picking at the scientific stuff that I was taught, specifically, young earth creationism and stuff like that. So that was where really started to kind of think about other people's perspectives for the first time.
Okay. So it was more from the scientific objection perspective that you were getting pushback.
Yeah. And basically what happened was when I was one summer, I kind of decided that I would just dedicate the whole summer to researching the topic to see, you know, because I had never even really heard otherwise than what I was taught growing up. And I dedicated that summer to trying to figure out if, you know, this young earth creationism stuff was legit. And I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that it wasn't. Started researching different, you know, basic biological arguments and stuff about the age of the universe and all that stuff. And it really threw me through a loop because I didn't have any way to distinguish those beliefs from Christianity. That's just, I just thought of it as one holistic unit. And so when I really seriously started questioning that, it kind of put me into like an existential crisis where I just thought I had to start from scratch. And so that's pretty much what I tried to do. Toward the beginning of that summer, I kind of realized I didn't believe that the earth was 6,000 years old anymore, which to me meant that I didn't believe in Christianity anymore. So I started looking around at all the different, you know, religions and philosophies. And that was, this was like around 2010, 2009, 2010. So that's kind of when the new atheist movement was kind of like at its peak. So I came across like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, primarily those two, and started getting their books and listening to a lot of their debates and lectures. And by the end of the summer, that was the train that I was riding for sure. I was full on. I felt like I had been lied to. I became kind of a outspokenly, militantly atheistic, and so that kind of led to high school. Basically, that was my high school experience.
Is that the age when you would be described as mocking Jesus in the title of the conversion?
very
is
very thoroughly, yeah. So basically, the reason I talk about mocking Jesus is because after I became an atheist, I was, you know, that's when I went to high school. After that, it was the summer between middle school and high school that I became an atheist. So when I went to high school, even though the few people that I happened to be spending a lot of time with weren't Christians, everybody else that I was interacting with was. And they quickly started to mock me for not believing in God. And there was a lot of different circumstances that occurred during high school where I started kind of feeling very defensive, and that pushed me to speak out more and more against Christianity. Started getting into a lot of debates with people. I never really lost interest in Christianity. I still read the Bible all the time and, you know, did different research, but just from the other's perspective now, where I was trying to figure out ways to disprove it to people. And that kind of climaxed when one year we had what we called Spirit Week, which was kind of like the week leading up to prom. And every day of the week had a different event that was assigned to it where you would do different things. And one of the days of the week was called Fictional Character Day. And that was when you got to dress up as whatever your favorite fictional character was, you know, SpongeBob, whatever. And I went as Jesus Christ to Fictional Character Day. And that caused kind of a stir at my school.
What were the reactions?
Well, basically before the first period even started, the principal and the assistant principal and the school resource officer came over to me and demanded that I remove the costume. That they said I wouldn't be allowed to wear it for the remainder of the day. And so I got into a bit of an argument with them. I tried to justify that I should be able to wear it. You know, they said Jesus isn't a fictional character. And I said, well, even if he was a historical person, you know, what you believe about him is fiction. I don't think he actually did these miracles or, you know, said these things or whatever. So I'm dressing up like the Jesus that is fictional, even if there was a person who was named Jesus. But they weren't really interested in having a discussion about it, so they just made me take it off. And And so but the way that worked
Yeah,
out,
because that distinction kind of doesn't come out in just dressing as Jesus,
yeah, the point of it is just mockery, yeah.
Right.
And that was the point. I didn't really expect them to be like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We'll just let you wear it for the rest of the day. But then it was kind of the talk of the school for the rest of the day, because even though I had to take it off before school really started, everybody had already seen it as we were walking in and everything. And most of the students kind of thought it was funny. It wasn't really like a big deal to them. It wasn't super scandalous. They just, it was kind of just like outrageous. But what ended up coming of that is that when I went home, I had heard about an organization called the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Dan Barker. Yeah.
Yeah. And I sent them an email and told them what happened. And, I said, I went to school on this fictional character day dressed like Jesus, and they made me take it off. And then they got back to me pretty quickly and told me that they were going to send a very strongly worded letter both to my principal and to the superintendent of my school district, basically threatening to sue the pants off of them for inhibiting my freedom of speech and stuff like that. And they also gave me a scholarship, $1,000 scholarship, to write an article about what happened that day for their newsletter. And so I got one of their scholarship awards, and then they sent these letters to the school district, to the superintendent, to my principal. And then that's when it really blew up, because then the local Channel 4 News got a hold of that, and it started going around the internet, intelligently designed costumes, stuff like that. People were posting then they got contacted by the local news, and then they came to my house, and then they were interviewing me. So then a couple of days later, I'm showing up to school, and now everybody's coming up to me and saying, hey, I saw you on the news talking about what happened. So it kind of became my 15 minutes of atheist fame.
What happened with the school? I'm just curious. Did they back down, or did they stick with the principles and nothing happened with the Freedom for Religion?
Yeah, I think it was what happened was basically the actual letter from the Freedom from Religion Foundation essentially said, if we ever hear anything happening again. So it was kind of just like what happened was they just didn't mess with me anymore, was basically what happened. I didn't really get a lot of pushback about my ideas from then on. They didn't really want me running back to them or anybody else, because there were other people who had experiences. Like, for example, my brother and I went to the same school for a period of time, and he actually had borrowed my book, one of my Richard Dawkins books, and he was reading it during like a break period in one of his classes, and one of the other students came over and grabbed the book and threw it on the floor across the room. And then when he kind of appealed to the teacher to be like, hey, you shouldn't let your students do this to your other students, and then the teacher was just like, well, it's a stupid book, what do you want me to do? So it was kind of like, whenever this kind of stuff would come up, it was, so I had mentioned these types of situations to them, and they basically said, if we hear anything again, then it would really do something. So from then on, there wasn't a lot of pushback from the school.
Not the best way to refute a book, I might add.
Yeah, just to throw it. I mean, it worked for them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So you, this was during high school. So what kind of happens after high school when you get into your college years?
Well, I didn't go to college because while I just actually recently started going to school, back to school. But at the time, when I left Christianity, I said, it was kind of a full force thing. So I didn't just leave it intellectually. I left it with my lifestyle too, because a lot of the people that I was, starting to run with and everything were really into stuff like drugs, that kind of stuff. So as I was going through high school, I kind of started living an increasingly degenerate lifestyle. Getting into drugs, getting into promiscuous sex, getting into really having into pornography, for example, and ended up getting actually arrested for drugs and everything. I was all into that kind of stuff. So when I didn't actually make it all the way through high school, because I took atheism to what I would consider to be its logical extreme, which was for me a sort of like radical nihilism. I just didn't think anything mattered. I didn't believe there was a morality. I didn't believe there was a meaning. For me, it was all just, try to get as much pleasure out of this ride while you can. And so that's kind of the road that I was going down. But that pretty quickly led to just despair, where there was no meaning for me. So I dropped out of high school, ended up just unemployed, high school dropout, really into drugs. That was kind of like every day was kind of centered around just like my friends and I would get together. And then the first plan would be, how do we get high? And then the second plan is, what are we actually going to do after that? And so so I ended up dropping out of high school. I just didn't see the point of it. Was really frustrated with the whole environment. I wasn't necessarily doing poorly. I was taking AP classes and everything. It wasn't that I was having a hard time comprehending any of it. I just didn't understand why I should care.
Yeah.
So I ended up dropping out, and then that only made things get worse, because now I don't even have the socialization of school. So my whole day is just spending time with these people who are really bad influences, and then getting more and more into basically just total rebellion, but in just like an existential way where I just didn't care about anything. And then I just ended up getting really depressed, very depressed to the point where I was going to kill myself. Actually, that's where it ultimately ended up taking me.
To despair. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if there's no purpose to life, I kind of think that, I mean, if there's nothing really beyond this life, I should say, what really is the purpose to this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There wasn't much one for me. And so pretty much what ended up happening was after I decided to drop out, not too long after that, my mom ended up getting evicted from like the apartment that we lived in. Very short notice with like no explanation. And she couldn't really afford to do anything about it. So we ended up moving back to Florida to try to figure out, a family situation, a backup. And then, so now not only was I kind of an unemployed pothead high school dropout, but then now all my friends were in another state. So basically that's when I really got to the point where I was actually considering just ending it, because the only thing that I was really living for was the little bit of, not great society that I had. Yeah. And so I got to the point of total rock bottom, and the situation that we were living with wasn't great. We ended up not really being able to find somewhere to live. So my mom and my three brothers and I ended up being homeless for months, basically homeless. I mean, we lived in like a 1-room motel all together that cost like my mom's whole month of, getting paid and trying to work to stay in. So that was when I think the kind of the Holy Spirit started making me question my beliefs again. But this time the atheist beliefs, I started really thinking about like, where has this taken me? And that's what transitioned to even starting to consider it.
You're feeling despair, and you're just starting to question, whether or not you went down the right track that brought you to this perspective at this point, or if you made a wrong turn somewhere. Is that effectively it?
It was honestly, I wouldn't even say it was as thought out as that. It was really, it didn't feel like it was something that was coming from within me, because at the time I didn't really have any conscious humility of maybe I made the wrong decision. I was still completely convinced that Christianity was absolute nonsense and that there really was no meaning to life. But there was just kind of like, I would say it was more like a nagging feeling. Maybe you're wrong about Christianity. It was more of that. It wasn't so much at the time an internalized realization that what I believed had taken me down the wrong path. It was more just almost an external question that kept being posed to me. And I just couldn't brush it off forever. And basically what I ended up deciding to do was challenge God, is kind of the way that I would put it. I had Bibles, I had been reading them pretty much nonstop, even though I didn't believe, just because I used it as ammunition in my arguments. But one day I kind of just kept having this feeling, so I decided to challenge God. And I thought, if I, challenge God and nothing happens, then I'll just, probably kill myself soon anyway. But if I do and something happens, then, maybe that's why I keep having this nagging feeling. So one night I kind of went into my room alone and I grabbed one of the Bibles that I had and I prayed something along the lines of, God, I'm not even sure why I'm talking to you right now because I'm pretty sure you don't exist. But if you did, now would probably be the last opportunity that you had to show me that. And if you don't, then, and then at that point I was like, what am I even doing? It was a challenge, but at the same time, I thought like I was talking to an imaginary friend. And so then what I would do is I would say that basic prayer every day and then read a little bit of the New Testament. I started in Matthew, I'd read just a little bit every day. And essentially what started happening was every day as I did that, there would be a coincidence that would happen right after I stopped reading. That was kind of too hard to ignore. Like one example would be one day it was actually the 4th of July, and I said my little prayer and I was reading through and I got to the part where, Jesus says, don't cast your pearls before swine, don't give what is sacred to the dogs. And then that was like basically one of the last things I read. And then I put the Bible down, and in a second that the book hit the desk, there was a knock on our door. And so I go open the door and it's our next door neighbor. And he's like, hey, Jeff, I'm not sure if you guys are doing anything for the 4th of July, but we're having this cookout. So, if you're not busy, you could come over. And so I'm like, okay. And I start walking over. And as soon as I enter their yard, his dad looks over at me. And before he says anything else, he just says, I hope you're hungry. Otherwise, we're going to give your food to the dogs. Mm-hmm. And so he basically just quoted the last verse that I read. And stuff like this just kept happening. Mm-hmm. Every day for months. It wasn't just like a couple times. That was one of the most memorable ones. And so eventually I kind of got to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. And then that's when I kind of went back into my room one night and I said, I'm still not really sure how it's true that you could exist. At this point, I had no intellectual reason to convert to Christianity. I just had these constant interactions with people where people would come up and they would just quote the last verse of the Bible that I'd read or something like that. And so that's when I decided to basically ask God if he was willing to take me back.
So I guess you prayed a prayer, or this was just kind of your disposition. You were asking God to take back.
It was a prayer, yeah. It was honestly, I could physically feel like a change, I guess. It's hard to describe, but how people say they feel like a weight got lifted off their shoulder. Like sure. I actually felt a physical relief that kind of like something was exiting my body or being lifted off of my body. And then we kind of actually have to step back a little bit in the story for what happened next to make sense.
Yeah.
Because so when I was an atheist, well, all throughout high school and everything, actually I kind of slowly drifted away from what I would call like hardcore atheism, like pure atheism. Mostly because of all the drugs and stuff, because most of the people who are really into drugs end up having some sort of kind of like pantheistic, new agey, kind of occulty, spirituality type of thing and that's kind of what all my friends were into. It was, that we're all kind of this divine essence that we're experiencing in these ecstatic states and everything like that. So, because basically what happened was when I was originally an atheist, it was basically just a reaction to my fundamentalist upbringing, right? And so as I got more and more into the lifestyle that I was living and further away from my Christian roots, I started realizing basically that my atheism was just a reaction to my fundamentalist Christianity. And I didn't want my belief system to be a rejection of another belief system. Even if I didn't think it was true, I didn't want my beliefs to be defined by not that, right? And so that's when I kind of started to adapt some sort of spiritual beliefs about different things. And that's when I started expanding my horizons a little bit, reading different philosophy, reading into like pagan mythology, different spiritualities, Hinduism, Buddhism, stuff like that, watching Alan Watts videos, that kind of thing. And so as my atheism kind of deteriorated into vaguely pantheistic spiritualism, I got really into different types of pagan mythology. And one particular god that I was drawn to is called Sobek. And so Sobek is the Egyptian crocodile god of the Nile.
Yeah.
And he, one of his epithets is he who eats, well, he also mates. And he was kind of known as like the carnal god of pleasure and self, gratification and stuff like that. And so I kind of adopted Sobek as like an anti-patron saint kind of thing, where he was like I didn't really worship him, but I kind of really strongly associated with him. Like whenever I made, like an online username or something, or like I would always call myself Sobek. And actually the way that I did it was I kind of did like a little cult ritual by myself, where I went to like a nearby creek that was in Tennessee, and I did like I guess you would call it like a naming ceremony, where I like adopted Sobek as like my patron deity or spirit animal or something like that. It wasn't really well thought out, but so that is what ended up playing a big role later on. Because when I prayed that night that I told you about, when I finally decided to, I guess the way I would have phrased it at the time is give Christianity another chance, because I wasn't really convinced at all by it yet. But I figured if I gave it a go and nothing happened, I'd be right back where I was. So it was kind of like a no-lose situation. So when I ended up praying for God to take me back, and in the same prayer, I renounced Sobek. I renounced any association with him. And then that prayer was said right before I ended up going to bed for the night. Now, at the time, I hadn't had a dream in years because of all of the drugs that I was doing. It kind of just made it so every night was just a long blank darkness. I never had dreams. It wasn't that I didn't remember when I woke up. I didn't have them at all. But when I went to bed that night, I had the most intense and vivid and clearly symbolic dream that I've ever had in my life. And it's the only one I've ever been able to remember from beginning to end years later. I can still remember it. And essentially, I was walking along the shoreline of this vast river and as I'm walking, I noticed that this huge crocodile emerges from the water, and he starts chasing me, and he's snapping his jaws, and he's running after me as fast as he can. And so I start running in the opposite direction, obviously fearing for my life. And as I'm running, I end up tripping and falling face first in the sand. And so as I try to recover, and I'm kind of turning back upwards and trying to stand to my feet, I expect him to be there, already having caught up to me. But when I stood up, there was kind of like this angelic figure who was standing between me and the crocodile, which was Sobek, obviously. And then the crocodile is like cowering back into the water. And then I woke up. And for me, it was very clear what the meaning of the dream was. And it was not only shocking to me that I had a dream that I could remember after years of not having any, but to me, it was very clear that it was kind of a confirmation of the fact that I converted to Christianity and I should not go back. And the meaning to me was basically God was stepping in and ready to protect me from my old life at this point. Wow. And that's when I actually considered myself a Christian, because the night before it was kind of like a game almost. But then when I woke up, I was completely different.
So what happens next? What do you do after that?
I started telling people about it, and they didn't believe me. I started talking to my old friends. I was sending them messages, online and everything, and telling them that I converted to Christianity. And almost all of them thought it was a practical joke. They didn't believe me. I was the most outspoken atheists that most of them had met personally. And some of them were mad because some of them were Christians who now weren't Christians because of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was a number of people who I had kind of effectively proselytized when I was an atheist. So then now I've got people hammering me with questions. So there was a period of months where pretty much every day somebody was asking me something, because the people who were atheists were wondering what could possibly make me want to change. And then the people who were Christians were really excited, and they wanted to know how they could talk to other people about it. And then the people who were now atheists because of me definitely wanted to know what had changed my mind. But at the time, there wasn't really anything. So it was purely an experiential conversion at first, which I think was, in like retrospect, I think it was providential that God didn't want me to become a Christian because I figured it out. You know what I mean? He didn't want me to think he didn't want there to be any pride in the initial conversion. But when I started getting all these questions, I started digging into theology for the first time for real, where I wasn't just trying to figure out how to disprove it. I was starting to figure out, what do Christians actually think? Different kinds of Christians besides the kind of Christian that I was raised as. So I started reading, actually the first book I read was Training in Christianity by Soren Kierkegaard. It was recommended to me by someone online. And then the next book I read was St. Augustine's Confessions. And those two books radically altered my perception of what Christianity was. It was really like night and day. I didn't realize that, even though I had been reading about Christianity for a long time and I had been raised Christian, and when I was a Christian before, I was, pretty into it. But for the first time, I actually kind of started to understand what Christianity really was. And then I just kept studying. I started reading C.S. Lewis. G.K. Chesterton was really a big influence on me, stuff like that. And the more that I started studying, the more I started actually having things to say to people when they were asking me what had changed. So,
wow. So at this point, are you just kind of discerning various forms of Christianity, or is it not really on your radar? Or?
Yeah, I started to do that after a little while. Initially, I kind of thought I was like a special Christian, where, I thought I had, that I still didn't really understand that the types of Christians I was reading were like substantially more correct than the way I'd raised. I thought that I was kind of just managing to interpret them in this unique way that made sense, but I wasn't really orthodox at this point, even like at a basic level.
Yeah.
Because I was still slowly trying to transition away from my lifestyle, because even though the intellectual belief part of it was really drastic, it took years and years for the way that I was living to change. And so a lot of my beliefs kind of remained the way that they were, just so I could justify continuing to live the way that I did. I probably would have called myself like an existential Christian, like a spiritual but not religious Christian. But that wasn't really sustainable for long, because the more that I started reading into it, the more I started to realize that there was a huge history to it and a very deep systematic structure to what I was reading. And that was why it made sense, that people had been thinking about it for a long time. So I didn't go to church at all for a little while, just because I still thought I was just some vaguely spiritual Christian that was unique. But after a while, I did start going back to church, but it was just where I kind of left off. I didn't really know any different. So I started going to, I guess what you'd call non-denominational churches, vaguely Baptist in their tradition, but they wouldn't say so. And it automatically struck me as off. Not because it wasn't what I was used to, but because it didn't really match up what I was reading. So I was reading all this stuff, Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, that were two of the main ones. And then I would go to these different non-denominational churches, and I would be like, am I even in a church right now? Like, if there wasn't that cross on the wall, it's just there's a band, and then, people are kind of eating and drinking coffee. And so I was just kind of not really sure what was going on. And so I started asking people questions. I was really into it, and everybody seemed to be pretty interested in the fact that I just kind of randomly started showing up as this guy who was an atheist 6 months ago. And I started going to these different Bible studies and small groups and stuff, and started asking questions, getting really kind of interesting answers. Because and you have to understand, for me, I was coming at Christianity as a former atheist. So it was less as I was like an ex-Protestant, because by the time I came back to Christianity, I was so far removed from my intellectual basis that I wasn't really even looking at Christianity like a Protestant. I was just coming at it as, I just suddenly think that this thing is true after having believed for years that there was absolutely nothing that was true. So I needed to ask the basic questions. So that's what I did. And most of the people, I think, didn't ever have people ask those kinds of questions. Because one time I was at a Bible study, and I just asked them, well, where are you getting these interpretations from? Like, is there a book I can read that explains to me what the tradition of this church's understanding of the Bible is? And they were like, we just read the Bible. Where did it come from? Why are these books? Because I had been engaging in all these different online discussions, and there's every kind of person under the sun online. So I had encountered people who identified as Gnostics, all different kinds of things. And so I was in a sense completely lost, but it was being completely lost that actually was allowed me to find Catholicism, because I wasn't coming at it with a Protestant bias. So that was what was unique for my experience. So essentially what started happening was, I started to realize that the people who were saying the things that made the most sense in the discussions that I was having online, and as I was trying to figure things out, were the people who were at least more magisterial Protestants, like Lutherans, Episcopalians, and then what Orthodox and Catholic people were saying started to become more interesting to me at this point. Because before that was the last possible thing that I would ever consider. Because even though I thought Christianity was true now, I was still very anti-organized religion, if that makes sense. So just because I had swallowed the new atheist pill fully. Just like one quick story, Christopher Hitchens, he died while I was kind of in the peak of becoming a outspoken atheist. And so when he was dying, they kind of sent out all these different messages on the various atheist forums and Reddit and different websites and stuff like that, and asked people to send in clips of themselves giving a toast to Hitchens and just saying, briefly, you changed my life, blah, blah, blah. And so that video, actually, I'm in it. If you look up a toast to Hitchens or something on that on YouTube, I look a lot different at the time, but I'm in that video giving a toast to Hitchens. And he did say that he watched it before he died. So for me, even when I became a Christian, Catholicism and Orthodoxy and that kind of stuff was just the last option, because it represented something beyond Christianity. To me, it was organized religion. So what ended up happening was that I kind of expressed these basic ideas to people online that, this non-denominational low church Protestant stuff is starting to really not make sense to me. But at the same time, I don't think I can go all the way Catholic or Orthodox. So what should I do? And they all basically told me to check out an Episcopalian church. So that's what I did. And that was my first experience of a liturgy. And not only was it my first experience of a liturgy, it was probably one of the most traditional liturgies I've ever been to, even today. It was incense, everybody received at an altar rail. It was very high mass, well, not high mass, but it was a very high liturgical expression of the the Anglican liturgy. And so I was completely blown away. I had never experienced anything like this before, but it automatically made a lot more sense to me. Even though I didn't understand what was going on, I had no clue what was going on. But the fact that this is what Christians would do on Sunday just made a lot more sense to me than show up somewhere with a coffee and listen to rock music. Because that's the way that it felt like to me. So yeah, it was called so the very high Anglican, Anglo-Catholic. That's what they called themselves, Anglo-Catholic. And so they automatically were very interested in me. And I think it was mostly because I was the youngest person there by at least 40 years. It was, I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. It was an extremely old parish. I remember sitting to myself thinking sometimes, like, is this going to start as a liturgy and end as a funeral? Like, I don't understand. Like, it was a dying parish, but all the people were extremely kind and just very happy to have somebody new around. And so the first couple of weeks I was there, I had some of the parishioners walk me around the entire parish, telling me all the history of the parish and then also the history of Anglicanism and how it was kind of like the middle way, the compromise between Catholics and Protestants, and how, it was so rich but also diverse. And I had the vicar who was there. He took me out to lunch a couple of times, and we talked about how I used to be an atheist, and very bright guy with a massive library. And one day after we came back from lunch, he just took me into his library and he was like, read this, read this, read this. And so I started doing that, and I was really content there for a while. But what I noticed was that they were exhibiting some of the things, some of the ideas in a different way, but the same kind of mentality that was what originally made me stop wanting to be an atheist. And what I mean by that is I stopped wanting to be an atheist because it was a rejection of something else. And that is what I felt like their whole denomination was. They were always talking about how they weren't something else.
Yeah.
And most of the time, what's funny, they were talking about how they weren't like the other Episcopalians. It wasn't even like they were talking about how they weren't Catholic. It was they were talking about how they weren't like the other Episcopalians, because these are very traditional. They weren't into LGBT, anything like that, or, women's ordination and stuff like that. So it seemed like every conversation kind of devolved to how they were right and all the other Episcopalians were wrong. And on top of that, we're even better than the Catholics. And so it was like, okay, a lot of the stuff you've been saying is really interesting, but why does it all have to be about not something else? Because that just doesn't seem to me like the way the truth would naturally express itself. It wouldn't have to define itself as a rejection of something else. It would just present itself as the truth. And so while this is going on, I was continuing all these online conversations I was having. And that's when I realized that the only people that I ever talked to that weren't defining themselves in, contradistinction to another group were Catholics. They were the only ones, because all the Protestants were explaining why they weren't Catholic and all the Orthodox were explaining why they weren't Catholic. But I didn't really see Catholics explaining why they weren't Orthodox or Protestant in like a definitional way. There was like an apologetic that they would give in explaining why they weren't Protestant or Orthodox, but it didn't seem as much like the foundation of their whole ecclesiology, if that makes sense. So that's when I actually started considering Catholicism for the first time, was when it hit me that it wasn't defined as not something else.
Yeah, and that's something I encounter a lot. I encountered it when I was discerning Catholicism. That certainly seems to be my experience with a lot of Eastern Orthodox as well. And it seems like they just there's this Eastern Orthodox show. I don't think it's on anymore, but the intro to the song was that, or the intro opening to the show was something about how we're Catholics but not Roman Catholic. We're this but not that. And then it's again, defining oneself based on not being something else.
Not being
It was
something else,
really
exactly.
characteristic in the opening of that show. And so, it's something I picked up on as well. So you began discerning Catholicism. How does that go? Did you really struggle with it, or
Not at all. Not at least the distinctly Catholic stuff. That wasn't what my problem was. My problem was more with the traditional Christianity as a whole thing.
Yeah.
Because even though I was going to this very traditional Anglo-Catholic Episcopalian parish, I still was kind of under the impression that there was a lot of leeway here. Because even though they were very staunchly anti, whatever the topic was, they still pushed the idea that there was a variety of acceptable opinions that you could have. Like, for example, I had been convinced of universalism.
Yeah.
I thought that universalism was obviously true. Like after it was explained to me in certain ways, I thought universalism made a whole lot of sense. So stuff like that. It wasn't really the things that would usually make a Protestant hesitant about Catholicism. It was just, if I do this, there's no longer this heresy option kind of thing. I can't maintain these various heresies that are acceptable in other. There was no longer a heresy option, basically. So that was what really. But the distinctly Catholic stuff, no, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Part of the way that it worked was that as I was going through this process, I had been keeping in touch with my friends back in Tennessee, like I said, and one day I mentioned to one of them that I was starting to really consider Catholicism seriously. And he did not want me to do that. And the way that he went about it was he got his youth pastor to contact me, Jesse. It's actually Jesse's birthday today, so shout out to Jesse. But we started talking every day. So he contacted me online and said, hey, I got this mutual friend of ours told me you've been looking into Catholicism and he was concerned about it. So, what's leading you to this? And so I told him, what I just told you. And he essentially started trying to figure out everything that he could throw at me that he could possibly throw at me. And so he's every day it's like, oh, well, I read about this, how do you handle that? And I would say, well, I don't know because I'm not Catholic, but I'll go look into it. And so then I would look into it and then I would come back to him and be like, actually, this makes way more sense than what you were trying to say. And so every time he would throw something at me, it really it pushed me further into Catholicism because I was kind of being forced to become a Catholic apologist before I was even Catholic.
Right.
And we would have very intense discussions. I mean, for probably like 8 months, we would be talking every day, either, texting all day long, or we would get online and have, video conversations for hours and hours. And so, but what was interesting about it to me too, was the further this conversation went, the more anti-Catholic he became, because he started out, he wasn't really sure. He knew he didn't believe in Catholicism, but he didn't have a very systematic objection to it. He was researching objections and then bringing them to me. He didn't already have a bunch of them, And so he actually ended up becoming a Calvinist while we were talking. And so it was kind of like he realized, if I'm not going to be Catholic, I have to be really not Catholic. Because it was, there was the middle ground just didn't seem as convincing to him either anymore. So it was kind of like we were polarizing as the conversation went on.
Let me guess, he was listening to James White.
Oh yeah, loves James White. Actually, the debate between James White and Trent Horn about can a Christian lose their salvation or not, that came out while we were in the heat of this kind of conversation. It's either while we were in the heat of it or like right after I became Catholic, and that pushed me even further. There was one question that Trent Horn asked, I just thought it was amazing that James White had absolutely no answer to it, was when he just asked him, can you name me any Christian before Calvin who taught this? And there was nobody. And so for me, it seemed like that would be an important thing. So yeah, he was listening to James White and others. And so we would exchange books, exchange all these ideas and everything. But that ultimately just pushed me further into the church because, not only did it make more sense the more I had to defend it, but like I said, I wasn't coming at it from a perspective of having to get over it in the first place. So like for me, when I started learning about, Mary and the Eucharist and the apostolic succession and the papacy, that was just very exciting to me. I was like, well, this makes so much sense. Obviously, this would be the way that it was. So it wasn't, it was different. It wasn't from a former Protestant perspective so much as I used to be an atheist.
So were you considering also Eastern Orthodoxy? I know you mentioned them there. Was it something you were considering, or?
I did consider it for a little while. It was actually an Orthodox guy who made me he was one of the first people who ever made me question atheism, and not necessarily the way that you might think. So he was a guy who I came across when I was younger. I was really into like breakdancing and hip hop and music and stuff like that. And I was in a forum that was dedicated to that. And I ended up encountering a guy whose username was Break for Christ. So he was a Christian based breakdancer. And I was speaking on the non-hip hop related threads about my views, and he contacted me. And then he ended up sending me multiple books written by different Orthodox authors and priests and bishops and stuff like that. And when we were talking, he was probably the first Christian I ever talked to who I thought, this guy's not an idiot. That was kind of the way that he changed my mind. Because when I was a new atheist, that was what I was sold. What I told people was, people are only Christians if they've never thought about it, or if they're not smart enough to figure out that it's not true. So that was basically the way that I looked at it. So when I met somebody for the first time who was clearly not an idiot, that made me start thinking, how does somebody who's actually intelligent consistently hold these types of beliefs? And one of the main things that I liked about Orthodoxy was their understanding of the afterlife. So that resonated with me. The idea, the way that I understood it, at least at the time, was that when you die, everybody kind of goes to the same place, but depending on how your soul is, you'll experience it differently. Like Thomas Merton has an analogy that he gives where everybody's kind of like a ball of wax. And I know he's not Orthodox, but I'm just kind of connecting it to this. He has like, everybody's a ball of wax. The more on fire you are with the love of God, the softer you become as wax. And the harder and colder you are and the further away you are from God, the firmer you become. So when the judgment comes down, it's kind of like the signet ring. And the soft, malleable wax takes on the form of God, and the hard and cold wax shatters. So that was the way that I understood it. It made heaven and hell a lot more palatable to me. So I would say that Orthodoxy definitely was my first interest, because I saw it as a little less organized religion, than Catholicism. And that was actually one of the main things Jesse and I hashed out a lot. I'd say that one of the main things that made me not become Orthodox was divorce, divorce and remarriage. Because when I was looking into all the different Christian perspectives, it seemed to me that the Catholic one was the only one that was really consistent. And so I was convinced of that, and the fact that they didn't hold that as firmly definitely pushed me away. And also, it's a point that you've made many times, but when I was talking to Jesse, it all became about authority. Because initially, and I've had lots of conversations with Protestants, and what I've noticed is that it usually starts out with soteriology. They think you're not saved. And then once you can start talking about that a little bit, how much different is faith alone really, or how much does it really make sense? And then, so eventually they start getting to Bible alone. And that's what it all comes down to, and especially when they're Calvinists, they're very presuppositional a lot of times. So it's a worldview comparison thing. And so for me, when I was looking into it, I just kind of thought, there's no way for them to actually come to a decision anymore. Like they haven't had an ecumenical council that all of them have accepted since we weren't the same church anymore. So if their mechanism for deciding things doesn't work anymore, then like why would I go there?
So how did you end up becoming Catholic?
Basically, as I was going through all these conversations with Jesse, I started a new job, and the job that I started at, the store that it wasn't open until like 6 hours after I came in. I was working in the middle of the night. So I listened to different podcasts for like 6 hours every day. So I was listening to stuff like Catholic Answers. I listened to a lot of Matt Fradd stuff. I actually listened to a lot of Taylor Marshall's stuff before he became, before the Summer of Shame and everything, like when it was just catechesis. I mean, the early Taylor Marshall stuff. And it's actually kind of sad for me, like when I think about it, because when you go back and you listen to the earlier episodes, he just seems so much happier.
Yeah.
He just seems so much happier. Like he was a really great influence on me at the beginning. Yeah. And stuff like Matthew Leonard, Scott Hahn, Fulton Sheen, that kind of stuff. So between defending Catholicism before I was Catholic to Jesse, and then starting to listen to all of these Catholic podcasts for hours every day, that's when I decided that I needed to go to RCIA. And so that's what I did. And it was kind of frustrating for me just because I didn't want to wait. Like once I decided that I wanted to, I didn't want to wait. And also because the instruction that I received wasn't great. I've actually joked with people that if I hadn't decided Catholicism was true before I went to RCIA, that would have convinced me that it wasn't. Yeah. Because, like for example, the guy that was teaching, it was a layman who was teaching our RCIA class, and one day there was only a couple other people in my class, and they asked a clarifying question because they had been reading some other stuff outside of it, and they were saying, so I was reading something about how if you commit a mortal sin, you're supposed to go to confession before you receive the Eucharist. Like, can you tell me more about that? I don't understand. And he was like, well, the priests don't really offer confession that much anyway. And besides, when you're forgiven, God knows you're going to sin in the future. So your future sins are also forgiven. I wouldn't really worry about it that much. And I was like, really? So for me, at that point, and I actually mentioned to him in the class that I was like, I'm pretty sure that's not actually what, is officially taught. So kind of that experience of coming into the church, I kind of wasn't necessarily wearing rose-colored glasses when I came into the church. I wasn't expecting there to be absolutely no issues. And I've experienced some interesting stuff since coming in. Yeah.
Haven't we all?
Yeah.
So you've come into the church. All right. What has the experience been like overall?
I'd say amazing. Like I said, there have been things that happened that were, kind of disheartening and stuff. It's an interesting time to become Catholic. Oh, yeah. I feel like it's I have this zeal where I want to, evangelize and talk to people about it, but then things keep happening that make it really difficult, where you get someone really interested in Catholicism and then something happens and they're like, see, this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm worried about. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. I don't have any control over that. But actually one story I'll tell is, like I said, when I was really young, I started getting into pornography, and it became a pretty heavy addiction for me. Because it was, these days, earlier and earlier and earlier, people are being exposed to it. And it was pretty early for me. And so it became something where it was very addictive. And it was as a Protestant, because I started, having troubles with this before I became an atheist. That it was that young. And then when I came back, it was still a problem. And there was always this internal struggle where I was told that after you sin, you're supposed to confess to God. But I always just felt like I wasn't forgiven. Like I never felt forgiven because I knew I was going to do it again. And there was no like mechanism for me to know, like, was this acceptable to you? Like how, I didn't have the terminology at the time to think of like, perfect contrition, imperfect contrition. I just was thinking, am I even really sorry? Like, can you apologize if you're not actually sorry? So, but when I went to confession for the first time, boy, that was one confession, because I went in there. I had, multiple pages of paper, front and back, just listed the whole time. I was like, well, I was an open blasphemer and mocked Christ in public. I told other people he wasn't real, drugs, sold drugs, sex, all this stuff. And obviously porn was on the list. And when that first confession changed my life, I can honestly say that it was a miraculous experience for me. That after I went to my first confession, I never experienced a desire to watch pornography again. It was a truly miraculous grace. And for me, that really solidified Catholicism for me, because I understood how sacraments were actually efficacious on an experiential level at that point. And so for me, there was no turning back at that point, because when I was wanting to become Catholic, one of the main things that drew me toward Catholicism was learning about the Eucharist, because I thought, if the Eucharist is legit, then like, how could you not be Catholic? Like if they really have Jesus there, like, and that was part of why RCIA was so frustrating for me, not only because I wasn't getting the best instruction, but I was waiting and waiting and waiting for the Eucharist. And so, once I experienced the Catholic sacraments for the first time, in my first confession, and it profoundly changed my life. I knew I couldn't go back after that.
It's awesome. I've been on the edge of my seat this entire testimony. I see why the Coming Home Network published it. I know they have really good content, but I definitely see why they chose this one. I think it was also the most read conversion story for 1 year. Is that right?
It was the most read conversion story that they published last year. So
I'm going to put a link to that. So it's just at the Coming Home Network. You can just type in Jeff Shott. Will come right up.
From mocking Jesus to worshiping him usually brings it right up.
Wow. Man, this has been really, really interesting. I'd love to have you back on the show and hear more about your experience now, as you've been a Catholic for, I think you said 5 years, right?
5 years, yeah.
I think you mentioned you've been listening to the show. Have you been listening to it because you've been considering other things, or you just have been trying to find out how to answer others? Or
one of the main things that one of the main reasons I was listening to it was all because of how you deal with like radical traditionalism, right? Because I was kind of drawn toward, like I said, I started listening to Taylor Marshall before all of that, and then so I was listening to him as he transitioned into that, and then the further that went, the more uncomfortable I kind of started feeling about it, but without understanding why, really. And so like your stuff really helped me out with that. And actually I'm studying theology now at the Catholic Distance University. So,
how's that going?
I'm really enjoying it so far. So this kind of content is just right up my alley at this point.
I checked them out a while back. What program is it that you're in, if you don't mind me asking?
So I'm starting out because, like I said, I dropped out of high school. So when I decided that I wanted to study theology, I had to get my GED. Yeah. So I got that earlier this year. And then so they have basically they break it up into where you get your associates first, and then you can do a bachelor's completion. So I'm in the associates program right now, and that's just liberal arts with a concentration in Catholic studies, and then you go into a bachelor's in theology from there.
Nice. So how long is the program?
Well, the associates is 2 years. They give you a maximum of 4 years because most of the people who are in it, like me, they work full time, they have families and stuff like that. Right. So they give you a maximum of 4 years, but I'm planning to finish it in 2 and then go into the bachelor's.
And I know how that goes. Ooh, doing that while you have full-time job
Yeah,
and family and everything,
the kid,
it's a
yeah,
struggle,
toddlers.
but it's rewarding. It's
Oh
certainly
yeah, I'm loving it.
rewarding. But yeah, I know. But that's awesome. That's good. So the program so far has been good. They're focusing on Christian studies, you said?
Yeah, it's a Catholic studies. From what I can tell, it's a very
Yeah.
orthodox. I've been enjoying all of the instruction in the classes so far, and it works out for me because I do work full time and I have a family and all that stuff. So I couldn't really pursue a higher education
Sure.
otherwise. I kind of
Yeah.
need the flexibility that you get from online, distance learning. So yeah, I've been thoroughly enjoying it so far. One of the reasons why I decided to do it was because I was talking to a priest friend one time about how I listen to these, like for example, I listen to the Institute of Catholic Culture a lot too.
Man, good
Yeah.
stuff.
So
Yeah.
because I would start a course and then just finish it by the end of the week
Yeah.
because I
Yeah.
was listening to 6-7 hours a day,
Right.
and
Right.
so I was just flying through these courses. And one day I was telling a priest friend about it, and he was like, you basically have already listened to a master's degree worth of
Right.
content. You just
Right.
need
Right.
to actually, like, if you listen to 6
Just
hours
go
of
through with
lectures a
it.
day for 5 years, like you just need to actually go through and do the work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just trying to do the work.
Sounds like we're cut from the same cloth. I remember doing this exact same thing. And I was listening to Westminster Theological Seminary and their lectures, Reformed Theological Seminary, their lectures, Covenant Theological Seminary, their lectures. This was when I was Presbyterian,
Mhm.
listening to all this stuff, but I wasn't working on a degree yet. And then also came into the church, listened to a ton of ICC lectures in addition to everything else I could get my hands on. Still wasn't working on a degree, so I finally said, oh, "Okay, let me go ahead and start working on one
Yeah.
so I could get some credit for some of this stuff." So
Yeah.
I know how that goes.
One thing that happened, like after I came into the church, was I met a guy named Ray, and ran into him at daily mass one day, and then he's like, "Hey, you want to get a beer and a burrito?" It was a noon mass, and I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
like, "Sure." And so he's a secular discalced Carmelite.
Cool.
So
Mhm.
he's like, yeah, and so he started talking to me and stuff. And he kind of took me under his wing, and so now I'm in formation with the secular discalced Carmelites, and it was kind of their formation because they focus on having a holistically human development, and so they kind of pushed me to realize you have the capability and the desire for higher education, but I think part of what it was there was just like an emotional psychological block because I associated that time in my life. It was the darkest time of my life when I decided to drop out of school, and so yeah, and my wife also was pushing me and encouraging me to. She was actually the one who gave me the idea to write for the Coming Home Network. She found like their submission form, and she was like, "You tell everybody your story anyway. Why don't you just
Just
tell
put it
everybody your
there.
story anyway?" And
Yeah.
so she and my friend Ray and the other Carmelites pushed me to actually get into the theological studies on a formal level, and so far it's been
That's
very,
awesome.
very, very enjoyable and rewarding, like you said.
Yeah, I remember, like I said, I've looked into Catholic Distance University before, and for what I remember, their program looked really good. So I'm excited for you. Here's a question here from Teresa. Does the portrait of Our Lady of Guadalupe hold a special devotion for you?
In a sense, when I was coming into the church, when I was in RCIA, I was given a book by a friend who's actually now an SSPX seminarian. So, but he and I went to the same Baptist church as children, and then converted to Catholicism independently, and then kind of he came into the church a little bit before I did, and so we have been keeping in touch. But before he went to the seminary, he gave me a copy of True Devotion to Mary by St. Louis de Montfort, and he ended up actually being my confirmation saint. That was very, like I said, and you would think that somebody who was just coming into the church, that might be a little much for them, but I was in love with it. I thought, this is amazing. It makes so much sense to me. So yeah, I don't know about Our Lady of Guadalupe specifically as like
Mm-hmm.
a title, but it definitely, I've had a deep devotion to Mary ever since I actually started praying the Rosary before I ever seriously considered Catholicism, just because I was, so that,
Anglican.
once you do that, it kind of
Yeah. Some
leads you in.
Anglicans will pray, the Rosary or pray a robe or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was interested in the traditional aspects of Christianity, just and the history of it and everything, but not, certain parts of it that I thought I didn't want to give up on yet. So,
yeah.
But definitely, Mary has played a big role in my life. Like, for example, like this is when you read the actual story from mocking Jesus to worshiping him, this is at the end, but it's actually coming up on just a few days from now. Will be a year anniversary from when my wife and I lost our son.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, he was born prematurely. So it was actually last Lent. I was, it was when she was pregnant. But what happened was she had a kind of not completely unheard of, but pretty rare condition called a subchorionic hematoma, which basically means that the uterus and the placenta weren't fully connected. So it was really a rough situation because the way that it worked out was when we went to the first ultrasound, they discovered this. But what they told us was that the way this is going to work is either in a few weeks there's going to be no baby, or everything's going to be fine. Like it's a toss up. Either this resolves itself, or it goes downhill really quickly. But we didn't have that experience. It just got worse and worse and worse without ever. They kept telling us, "Oh, it's gonna be bad. It's gonna end." And then he wasn't actually born until 20 weeks. So right before he would have been viable to survive. And that was one of the most profound experiences of my life. And I definitely don't think I could have went through that without the faith. We had so much support from everybody, and also just having the understanding, a deeper understanding of suffering and also service. Because when my wife was pregnant, she had this, it was basically a constant hemorrhage. So she was bedridden for months leading up to our son being born. And then, so that meant that I had to do everything because we already had who at the time, our daughter is almost 2 years old. So it was only a couple of weeks after he was born and died on the same day that she turned 1. So she's almost 2 now. So my wife was bedridden. I was working and also basically having to raise our daughter by myself for a period of time. And then having to obviously experience that my wife, because with my wife, it was touch and go too. Like they were concerned about her because she just constantly, it was not a good health situation for her either. So it was extremely difficult, but like I said, praying the rosary, I prayed the rosary, the whole rosary every day for a period of time. I would pray 15 mysteries or 20 mysteries every day. And that really helped me get through it. And then since this happened, it's completely revolutionized my understanding of spirituality. It's kind of one of those bittersweet things. For example, I baptized him when he was born. I told because I knew that I could. The doctor told us before he was born that he was probably not going to live beyond an hour. That was the longest that they thought that he would survive. It ended up being 5. So that was, they had said they had never seen that before.
Wow.
But, the way that it worked was I told the doctor, because he told us this is happening right now. Like you're going into labor and it's not this, by the end of the day, you're not going to have a baby anymore. And so then when he told me that, I was like, then you are going to give the baby to my wife and then I'm going to baptize him immediately. And then you guys can do whatever you have to do.
Right.
And so that was very powerful. And then like when he was, and so I kind of assumed the role of godparent and everything. So after I baptized him, I took him and I recited like the Apostles' Creed and the Our Father to him and stuff like that. So, but now, I mean, he's a saint. He's a baptized infant. You know, it was cool for us too, because when we go to an FSSP chapel, and when we had the mass for him, it was what they call the Mass of the Angels. So it wasn't like a requiem mass. The liturgical color was white and everything, and the homily was all about, this is a celebration of someone that we can know. The only one of the only kinds of people you can know without a canonization that's in heaven, for sure. So yeah, It's been a profound experience.
Man, it's a blessing that you're able to baptize them. Wow.
Yeah.
Man. Heart goes out to you, but at the same time, I'm just happy to hear about that baptism. So, wow.
Yeah. And I found that also it helps you connect to a lot of other people, because these kinds of things are more common than a lot of people know.
Sure,
miscarriages or losing premature babies and stuff like that. But nobody talks about it unless you talk about it. So what I've found is that by being, and my wife is also big on this, is that we're not ashamed of it, or, you know, like we're not, because we're looking at it from a Catholic perspective, you know, it's providence on the one hand, and also, you know, now we have a baby that we know is a saint. And so like, for example, when Father was giving the homily at this mass, he said, you know, every parent's job is to get their child to heaven. And so you're one of the only parents who is lucky enough to know for sure that you got at least one of your children into heaven, you know, and so you have that going for you as like a consolation. But so I found that it also helps with connecting to other people. If you're willing to talk about it, people who would have been hiding it keeping it inside are willing to talk to you about it.
Yeah, I think some people just, you know, some of those wounds are just so deep that it just takes a very long time for them to, you know, open up. If they ever open up, you know, I imagine there's some people, it's just, you know, they never ultimately find healing. But for others, they might find it, you know, sooner rather than later. But Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. It looks like everyone in the chat has enjoyed it. I know I've enjoyed it. You're welcome on the show anytime. Please stay in touch with me. Let me know also how your degree is going. I'd love to hear more about that. So
I'll definitely be reaching out to you. You'll be a great resource to have.
You're always welcome here. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Hit that subscribe button. Also go and check out Jeff's conversion story at the Coming Home Network, from mocking Jesus to worshiping him. I'll put a link to it there in the description. And also, if you want to support me, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology. And Jeff, do you have any plug that you want to put in for anything that you want to make the audience aware of?
No, just keep supporting you. This is great stuff right here.
I appreciate it.
Maybe someday, but
yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on, and everybody, thank y'all for watching and also for your participation there in the chat. All right, that's going to do it. We'll see y'all later. Have a good night. God bless.